But I think that's pretty much got that out of the way. We spent a lot of time on that, so I think that's good. But before we get into the show, though, I'd like to take the time, as usual, and run through some reminders. First being that if you have not heard the last week's Rewind number 32, TNA Slammiversary 2010, be sure to go ahead and check that out and give it a listen. It's just myself on that one, so be sure to support that and check it out. And also for for Sunday's show, the pay-per-view is Saturday night, but for Sunday's show, I gave my Impact Wrestling Slammiversary 2020 review as well. If you have not, give that a listen. And then also for Monday's show, we gave the horror show at Extreme Rules. I guess you could say review, recap, or maybe even rant, whatever you want to, whatever the right term is. Or I guess none of those, whatever you want to call it. I guess none of those three to describe it is necessarily incorrect or wrong. But yeah, so check out all those, and then coming up tomorrow afternoon, there will be a special announcement. It's not going to be a fourth show, but it'll be something in relation to the program. That being the announcement of part 3 of our summer lineup, our third and final part. Those will be for the month of August. The shows we have planned for August have been decided, and we do have everything set. We're not going to announce anything here because what would the point be of making the announcement on Wednesday be? I won't spoil anything just yet, but probably the most I can say in regards to that is to keep in mind that we do everything here and as in theme, which we've been doing that way for quite some time. In the beginning, we were kind of just doing whatever, we're just trying to feel it out and see what it's like. But if you put 2 and 2 together, you think of an event in August next month in wrestling that's going to be taking place. And you think of some of the past events that same pay-per-view in August has had, and over the span of the last 30 years or so, you might be able to figure out what we have in mind, but that's pretty much all I can say about it. If you still can't put that together or really comprehend it, no worries, because, we're going to make that announcement tomorrow, Wednesday afternoon, 12 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, for what we have planned for August, which should be another big month. And be sure to follow JNC Radio on Twitter and Instagram at JNC_radio, and follow our official Facebook page to stay tuned on all those updates, and because that's the best way to stay on top of everything JNC Radio related. And then finally, to close out July 2020, we have one final rewind in the lineup planned for this month, and that's a rewind number 34, ECW Heatwave 1998, considered by many to be the greatest ECW pay-per-view of all time. That card features Taz versus Bam Bam Bigelow for the FTW Championship in a Falls Count Anywhere match, a 6-man tag team match between Spike Dudley, Tommy Dreamer, and the Sandman versus the Dudleys, Masato Tanaka versus Mike Awesome, and more. Once again, Sunday, July 26th, will be Rewind number 34. One more thing, just in case you're a new listener of the program, let's take the time and tell you all the great ways you can listen to the show. JNC Radio is available on all top podcasting platforms, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts. You name it, we're on there. If we're not, just let us know. We'll do our best to try and fix that. And if you happen to listen to us on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts, be sure to follow our pages on both platforms. If you're a Spotify user, follow JNC Radio on Spotify. If you're an Apple user and you use Apple Podcasts, be sure to subscribe to us on there as well. So before we get into the show itself, I'd like to take the time and do something we do in every Rewind, and that's give some backstory as to how this event all came together. Previously, in the past for Rewinds, we've discussed the 2008 Royal Rumble, No Way Out, WrestleMania 24, Backlash, Judgment Day, One Night Stand, and Night of Champions. So we've covered all the 2008 pay-per-views up until this point, with the Great American Bash making it the 8th pay-per-view event of the year thus far in 2008. The main program heading into this pay-per-view over on the SmackDown brand, or maybe the main program, I guess, in general, because this would end up being the main event, is between the WWE Champion at the time, Triple H, who at this time had most recently made the move over from Raw following the WWE draft, and he's going up against Edge here at this time. Edge, following Night of Champions, had remained the World Heavyweight Champion. That was at least until he had decided to show up to Monday Night Raw that following night, and he would interrupt Jim Ross's Raw farewell address to the live audience. He'd have Kurt Hawkins and Zack Ryder escort JR to the back, and he would start to go on about how he was still the champion and that how Raw no longer had a world champion. So while he was out there by himself, Batista, whom Edge had defeated the previous night, would appear and absolutely take out his frustrations and pretty much destroy Edge. leaving him in prone position, which leads to what would happen next. Mr. Money in the Bank himself, CM Punk, would arrive and cash in his Money in the Bank briefcase for his title opportunity at any time, any place, and anywhere, and would hit Edge with the GTS and pin him to win the World Heavyweight Championship. Unless you count the ECW title, this would be Punk's first world title in WWE. For Edge, he would obviously not take this well and would begin to take out his frustrations on his fiancée, at least in storyline fiancée, Vicky Guerrero, who had on the July 4th edition of Friday Night SmackDown announced that Edge would be challenging Triple H for the WWE title at the Great American Bash. Throughout the night, Vicky and Edge would have their issues, which all would lead to the closing segment of the show, when Edge would tell Vicky that the wedding is off. And then the following week, on the July 11th edition of SmackDown, with Edge and Vicky no longer engaged, Vicky Guerrero would place her now ex-fiancé Edge in a match against the Big Show in the main event. Throughout the match, Big Show would beat down on Edge, and in the end, he was going to hit Edge with a concerto. This was until Vicky Guerrero would finally step in and stop the match. Following that, Edge would re-propose to Vicky, and the wedding would now be back on. The wedding ceremony would take place next week, earlier in the day, with the wedding reception taking place on the July 18th episode of SmackDown. Up until the end of the show, I'd say so far at that point, honestly, I mean, Edge and Vicky, their wedding, was not, in terms of like WWE weddings, I mean, that was probably one of the smarter planned ones, just because, I mean, at least they got married earlier in the day before the show, before it happened, like, on, like, SmackDown itself, and then, like, someone came out and, like, you know, destroyed the whole thing. So at least they got the marriage part done. But, however, despite all of that, things would not end well for the newly wedded couple, as Triple H would come out toward the end of the night with both Edge and Vicky in the ring with the rest of La Familia, and reveal that Edge had an affair with the wedding planner Alicia Fox. Then on ECW, the main program was between the newly crowned ECW World Champion Mark Henry and Tommy Dreamer.
Great feud there. We all needed to see that, especially with Colin Delaney in Dreamer's Corner.
Yeah, so this would all begin on the July 1st edition of ECW. The deal here would be that if Tommy Dreamer's protege, Colin Delaney, could defeat Mark Henry, then Tommy Dreamer would receive a title shot at Mark Henry's ECW title, which I don't even know if that even makes total sense, because if Colin could somehow beat Mark, then why would Tommy get the title shot?
Wouldn't Colin, whatever, who cares?
You know what? That's become a common theme on these rewinds I've discovered with the two of us, with the WWE ECW brand. It's like every single time there's an ECW match, we always have something bad to say about ECW for some reason.
Like I said, who cares? It's ECW.
Yeah, I mean, it did pick up over time, but I don't know. I guess it hadn't at this point yet. But well, they don't have Christian yet. Once they got Christian, there was always good matches. But nonetheless, Mark Henry would defeat Colin Delaney later that night, and Tommy would not get the title match, at least not yet. On next week's episode, Tommy Dreamer would face Mark Henry in a non-title bout with the WWE Hall of Famer Tony Atlas there that night as a special guest ring announcer for the match. During this, Mark Henry would begin to attack Colin Delaney, and Tony Atlas would step in momentarily to stop Mark for assaulting Colin, only for him to back off and allow Mark to continue the assault.
A duo that I don't think ever really made sense, and they were put together for like no reason. Like, it was so random.
Mm-hmm.
How long were they even together? Atlas and Henry.
I think for almost a year.
Yeah, like, but I remember like it was so random, and it honestly, like, it really didn't work.
Yeah, it was. I don't know.
When did Big Daddy V come in with the whole thing, and it was like...
Oh, that was with Matt Striker, I remember.
Matt Striker, my bad. Yeah, never mind, that was later. ECW, the whole thing is just...
Yeah, well, I'm not against the idea of putting Mark with a manager. Like...
No, neither am I, especially at this point.
But I don't know. I thought Tony Atlas was just a weird choice.
Yeah, so did I.
But Yeah, so Henry would begin to attack Colin, and then Tony Atlas would step in the middle of it, but then he'd back off, and then Mark would start to continue to assault him. But then Henry would get back in the ring, and he'd beat down on Dreamer, with the match ending in a no contest. In the process, Tony Atlas would turn heel and align himself with Mark Henry. And I guess somewhere along the lines, Tommy Dreamer would somehow earn himself the title opportunity against Mark at the Great American Bash. It's just like, how can anyone take this serious at that?
You can't. It was such a shit show, that whole run, the WWE CW.
No, as I said, like it picked up like once it got like Christian, and like they had like what was good about the show is it did give like an opportunity for some guys to come up and get on TV and just get some exposure and whatnot. Like it served its purpose. The problem is it was supposed to be ECW, and it had that that stigma, so it never had a chance to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
But for Monday Night Raw, there's actually a lot of stuff going on at this time. There's the continuation of the Shawn Michaels-Chris Jericho rivalry, the never-ending feud between JBL and John Cena, and the World Heavyweight Championship program between Batista and the new champion at the time, CM Punk. As noted earlier, CM Punk would become World Heavyweight Champion by cashing in his Money in the Bank contract, which he had won at WrestleMania 24 in the Money in the Bank ladder match. So now he'd be World Champion, and the World Heavyweight title would now be back on Raw. So, yeah, Raw would have a world title again. That same night, JBL would challenge CM Punk for his newly won title, and Punk would successfully defend the world title in his first defense, but with the help of John Cena and Crime Time. That's the other thing. It's like even when Punk won matches, like they never like once like allowed him to look like super credible. So that was I guess one big negative about it. That and he was never like the top guy in the show, and I never felt like it because, as I said, as I'm gonna say next, like he had like a world title match on one show, and like he wasn't even in the main event. It's like, come on.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, I think his whole run here, his first run with the belt, it just didn't work.
It didn't work. Like the first night he'd won it and he cashed in, that was exciting. And that got a reaction, but then after that, it's like he was just never portrayed as the top guy. But I mean, there were so many big names in that show too. I mean, there was Cena, there was Shawn, there was Batista.
But here's the other thing:
even Jericho at this time was bigger.
You can't beat a guy. You can't make the world champion expect him to go over when he never beats any of the big stars clean.
I know. Exactly, and we're gonna definitely talk about that later. But yeah, so then on the next week's show, the July 7th Raw, CM Punk would defend his World Heavyweight Championship again. This time would be against Snitsky, which what Snitsky did earn that title opportunity, I have no idea. But nonetheless, Punk would win that match as well and retain the world title for the second straight week. On the same night, there would be a main event fatal four-way match to determine the number one contender to face Punk at the Great American Bash. That match would feature Kane, John Cena, Batista, and JBL, and which would see Batista pick up the win. And then I always remember that because after that match, Kane just went on some like random rampage. And then the following week, CM Punk would face Kane in a non-title match, which he would win by countout. Then afterwards, Kane would try to attack Punk, but then Batista would run in, and he'd attack Kane with the steel chair. And then Punk would try to offer a handshake to Batista, but then Batista would instead hit him with a spine buster. And yeah, that's all the backstory I have going into the Great American Bash 2008. Another thing worth noting before we get into like the show is this would be the final WWE pay-per-view event that was rated TV-14.
And they sure did. They did as much as they could with it with the Shawn Jericho match.
You got that right. Because after that, there was no way they could have pulled that off to the extent that they did. But I think the other thing though, when they made the switch from TV-14 to PG, it's like, yeah, you have that point there. Like you didn't see as much of like the intentional blood or obviously some of the language and some of the content was different. But in 2008, for me, like for the most part, you could really hardly tell the difference just because 2008, like 2007, it wasn't like that. I mean, maybe there was a little, but it wasn't like that over the top. But by 2008, it wasn't really like super edgy and like over the top.